Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Imagine Art's Martin Luther King Jr. Day National Service Day presentation. The title of our presentation is The Artist as Griot, The Importance of Storytelling. My name is Esty Kendra. I am an AmeriCorps member with Imagine Art this year for the 2020-2021 season. I am an artist in residence and I teach in the textiles department. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background about my organization before I let my co-presenters introduce themselves. Imagine Art is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that was established in 1996. It's based in Austin, Texas. Imagine Art works with disabled artists and non-disabled artists and provides them with materials, mentorship, and instruction opportunities so that they can develop their art and their professional practice. Imagine Art's slogan is that every life is a work of art. Currently, Imagine Art is in its second year of its AmeriCorps program, and Imagine Art employs approximately 17 artists in residence. Imagine Art's goal is to focus on a live and make creative placemaking model to develop a contemporary model of service for the disabled community and to create space where disabled and non-disabled artists can live and create art side by side. So now I will pass it off to my co-presenters to introduce themselves. Justine.
Hi, everyone. My name is Justine Noltz, and this is my first year with AmeriCorps and my first year with Imagine Art. I'm also an artist in residence. I'm a multidisciplinary artist, and I work with the fibers and textiles groups at Imagine Art.
Good morning. My name is David Corrales, and I'm a documentary photographer. I'm also part of the AmeriCorps team for 2020-21. I work on the exhibits team. And the exhibits team helps organize the artwork that's there at Imagine Art. We also manage the online store and also plan exhibitions. So that's the work that the exhibit team does. And today I'm very happy to be part of this team presenting to y'all today about storytelling.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. So right now, let's get into our presentation, The Artist as Griot, The Importance of Storytelling. Once again, this is our service project for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. So the griot is a professional history keeper and storyteller of the MLK or Mandinka people. A griot would memorize and recite the history of royalty, the births, deaths, and marriages of families. And they would recite these histories and genealogies at public events, weddings, funerals, and they also would tell the stories and fairy tales of their culture to share the philosophy and the morals of their society. Griots started their training as early as the age of 8, and this was a profession that required several decades of training, which is why they started them so young. Along with memorizing vast volumes of information, they also were trained to play musical instruments such as the kora. And so on the map, we have some illustrations of the Kingdom of Mali, a little bit of the dress of what the people would have worn, and some imaginings of the leadership of the Kingdom of Mali. The Kingdom of Mali was established around 1255 AD, and somewhere between 1260 and 1277, the king, Mansa Musa, made a pilgrimage to Mecca. He practiced Islam, and because of that, many Mandinka people also converted to Islam. And one of the things that that religion requires is for every practitioner to make a pilgrimage to Mecca at some point in their lifetime. Excuse me. And the reason that we know that he did this is because Islamic scholars kept a written record of the comings and goings of people and the history. So we can go back and look at those documents and see that Mansa Musa made this very highly publicized trip to Mecca. And so that connected those places. Many griots, as well as regular folks, were multilingual and literate for these reasons. Islam requires that followers learn Arabic and also learn to read and write in Arabic so that they can read the Quran. So many folks spoke Mande, Berber, Igbo, Hausa, Fulani, Yoruba, as well as Arabic, and could also read and write Arabic, Greek, and Latin, since those were the most popular written languages of the day. After the transatlantic slave trade, many Africans were forbidden to learn to read and write, and also because of what was going on with the Crusades and the Holy Wars, they were certainly forbidden to read and write in Arabic. And so because of this, they relied on the traditional storytelling methods of passing on information orally from person to person. And also because Africans of different civilizations and ethnic groups were forced to intermarry, many merged other storytelling practices and traditions with the griot tradition of the MLK people in order to preserve information. So on the left-hand side, we have an older black and white photo of a group of professional griots who are sort of posing for what looks like their graduation photo. And the instruments that they are holding is the kora. On the right-hand side, on the top, you also have a few pictures of modern day griots, and on the bottom as well, attending a griot festival. Traditionally, more so men would become griots, but as time passed, women were also allowed to be griots. And mostly this depended on the economic status of the family and whether they could afford to enroll their child to be a griot and pay for the instruments and things that were necessary for them to learn that. So in Indigenous African culture, storytelling is considered a community service, preserving the history of individuals as well as the history of groups of people and the nation, and preserving that culture so that it can be passed on to the next generation is very important. And today we sort of have a very different idea of community service. You know, we think of picking up trash, cleaning up parks, or maybe going to visit the elderly. The structure of Indigenous African society was very different. They lived sustainable lifestyles. They used everything. They recycled everything. They made sure that their homes and their communities were clean. And the elders always lived with the family until they died. So they really didn't have old folks' homes. They really didn't have trash that needed to be cleaned up. Traditionally, the women would get up before sunrise and sweep the village and make sure everything was in its proper place. And they would also do that again before sunset. So their idea of community service more so revolved around helping people remember the culture of where they came from and what their ancestors believed in, and helping people build those relationships with each other. Sometimes griots were called to be diplomats to weigh in on disputes between neighbors and certain political situations. Sometimes they were called on as advisors in that capacity, but over time, that role became a little bit less popular, and their importance really was on maintaining the cultural legacy of the community. So for this reason, this is the center of our service project, the artist as griot, the artist as the history keeper. Traditionally, that history would have been memorized and told to people, but now we have different ways of preserving and distributing information. So a modern example of a griot would be a novelist, a writer, and also a visual artist. So today we're going to talk about two visual artists and how their work puts them in the role of the griot, in the role of the history keeper. The first artist we're going to talk about is James Van Der Zee. James Van Der Zee is a famous portrait photographer. He was born June 29th in 1886. He was born in Lenox, Massachusetts, and he died in 1983. He lived a very long, successful life. He moved to New York in 1906 and he opened up his studio called Guarantee Photo Studio in 1916. He is one of the first Black photographers and he photographed many regular people during the Harlem Renaissance and also a lot of Black celebrities, including Marcus Garvey, Muhammad Ali, Jean-Michel Basquiat, and his work and his style influenced many. And David is going to help me talk about the technical aspects of his work and photography. He specialized in portraits, family portraits, and also in funeral portraits. If you'd like to see more examples of his work, you can look up the Harlem Book of the Dead, which was edited by Toni Morrison. And he even influenced filmmakers such as Julie Dash. And for an example of the techniques that she borrowed from him, you can see her film Daughters of the Dust. So here we have a quote by James Van Der Zee, and I'll let David jump in and explain the technical side and the history of photography.
Thanks, SD. I chose these two quotes to kind of illuminate or give some insight into James Van Der Zee's relationship with the camera and his craft. It's a hard job to get the camera to see it like you see it. Sometimes you have it just the way you want it, and then you look in the camera and you don't have the balance. Main thing is to get the camera to see it the way you see it. Being an artist, I had an artist's instincts. You can see the picture before it's taken, and it's up to you to get the camera to see it. I chose this picture of James at an elder age, primarily because of his eye, the main focal point of this image. Staring wide open, I imagine as if he was looking through the viewfinder of his camera, looking for that balance. As a photographer, I imagine that he knew how that light was going to hit the side of his face as he was posing. And he also had that well-timed exhale of that plume of smoke and knew what a dramatic effect it would have on that image. Van Der Zee used a large format camera back in the day. It was very large because it was big, and the negatives that it was holding were of large size, of 8x10, which gave it a great advantage. That's that great image quality that you see right there. The 8x10 negative in comparison to a 35 millimeter, the 35 millimeter is about 1.5 inches, so you can see the dramatic detail that you'd be able to capture on one of those large negatives. Some of the disadvantages are that large size and weight of the camera, which did not pose much of a problem for Van Der Zee, who used this primarily in his studio. There was also a steep learning curve involved with this camera. There is a lot of mechanics, manual mechanics to deal with, the bellows, the setting the aperture, and dealing with the large negatives and getting them in the camera without exposing them. But James Van Der Zee was a master at this. And in fact, by the time that he was shooting a lot of images in the 1920s and 30s, he'd mastered that part of his craft. Here's an image of his studio that was in Harlem around the Great Depression. I'm kind of struck by this image by the two subjects entering the room. The woman is wearing her long white dress, her gloves, a hat. Her husband has his hat in hand, wearing a suit. And I see his son, perhaps standing off to the side, loitering, biding his time, trying to avoid going into the shop. Perhaps he's not looking forward to getting his photo taken that day. But you can see that he's dressed in his tie, his suit coat, and shorts. When we were planning this presentation, SD had told a story about an experience she had with a photography studio, and I was wondering if you'd share that with us now, Kendra.
Sure. So when I was a toddler and my brother was a little baby, my parents took us to one of those photography studios in the mall. And honestly, I don't even know if they still have those type of stores in the mall, but in the 90s they did. And so my parents dressed us up just like the people are dressed in the photo. We had our little matching red and blue plaid outfits. And I was excited to get my picture taken. I always loved having photos taken of me and just getting to go out and do something new and do something different. And my brother did not like strangers, and so he started to cry. And he was just wailing, wailing. And the camera people tried to give him all these different props and to get him to calm down, and it did not work. And so they ended up giving him this little softball to hold. And so to this day, the photo is of me, and I'm there and I'm smiling from ear to ear, and I have my arm around my brother and he's crying. There are literally tears streaming down his face in the portrait, and he's holding this little softball. And it was just a portrait that we had over the mantelpiece of our home when I was growing up. It's something that I saw like every day of my childhood, every day of my adolescence, and I never really thought too much about it. But as we were discussing the subject matter of this and family portraits, and sort of wondering as we look through the portraits, what is the backstory of this day and what all did they have to go through to get ready for this event, it reminded me of that photo. I'm just like, oh my gosh, like my brother was literally so upset to have his picture taken, and I was not fazed by it at all, to the point where they couldn't get a picture of him smiling. They just had to go with the one of him crying because it was just too much. So I thought that was hilarious in retrospect.
I think a lot of us have those experiences at an early age, being kind of traumatized by that portrait studio experience. But as we get older and looking back at it, we can hopefully look at it and smile and laugh. And, you know, I think of that family and the preparation that they took in getting their clothes, their nicest clothes out for this, and preparing to have their photo taken by this famous photographer in their neighborhood. Perhaps they had seen images of his work hanging on the walls of their friends. They were dressed in their most formal outfits, which is quite impressive because this was during the Great Depression. This is during hard economic times, and this portrait would have cost quite a bit for them to pay for. I talked a little bit about James Van der Zee's style, and I've selected a couple of quotes. And the first one is, somebody would come in and say, "I'd never take a good picture." I'd say, "Why not? You've got two eyes, a nose, and mouth like everybody else." I tried to see that every picture was better looking than the person. When I look at this picture of this young woman, I'm reminded of the Victorian images that were taken by early photographers. I also am thinking about those paintings of royal subjects where they have their hunting dogs or their dogs of leisure in the photo with them. I see that she's standing, and you can see that she's holding one hand against the wall to kind of brace herself, and with the other hand, she's holding a hat. It's always good to have someone doing something with their hands in a photograph. Unlike some of those early photographs, you see that she has a big smile on her face. Usually, in those early photographs, everyone had a very grim and somber expression on their face. This was partly to do with the fact that back in the very earliest times of photography, you had to hold a pose for 1, 2, maybe 5 seconds, and it was very difficult for people to hold a smile, so they kept a very neutral expression. Here's another quote that I like. I had one woman come to me and say, "Mr. Van der Zee, my friends tell me that's a nice picture, but it doesn't look like you. That was my style." One of the greatest compliments a photographer can get from a subject is to say that they've captured a side of them that they haven't seen before. And I think this quote is a testament to that, and Van der Zee's ability to draw out of a subject that genuine, authentic self. That really comes from a lot of work with the camera and a lot of work with subjects. A famous headshot photographer was asked about what was the secret of the headshot, and he said it's about 10% the equipment and 90% building the relationship with the subject. And I think Van der Zee was an excellent builder of relationships based on the images that we see of his today. One other thing about that real nice, genuine smile, I'd be remiss to not say that Van der Zee was also an early proponent of photo retouching, and he wasn't afraid to straighten out a smile, take out some crow's feet. So perhaps that's also why people weren't recognizing themselves in their pictures. For this next part, we've selected a few images that we're going to talk about, and I'm going to invite SD to start the commentary, and I'll join in.
Sure. Okay, so here we have two of my favorite portraits of James Van der Zee. On the left, you have a married couple posing for their wedding photos. You can see the gentleman is wearing a tuxedo and the lady is wearing a long white dress with a train and a veil, and she's holding a bouquet of flowers. And they are sitting in what looks like a living room, sort of by the fireside. And the detail that I love is that in the editing process of this photo, James Van der Zee added in the image of a little girl playing with some toys in the bottom left-hand corner. And that is not an original part of the photograph. That is another photograph that he took of somebody else that he added in. And what I love about that is it fits in to the African aesthetic and the African philosophy of you being surrounded by your loved ones, both your ancestors and your descendants, and how even your children kind of sort of watch you from the other realm and just like check in and wait for you to be ready to bring them into this world. And so with this one portrait, he is hinting at not only the present of this couple and the fact that they're celebrating their wedding and starting a new life together, but he's also showing the future of this couple that at some point, most likely they're going to have a child. And so he's sort of giving you like on a fancy day in their living room, this is what they look like. But in the future, in their living room, they're going to have, small children with toys all over the floor, playing and entertaining themselves. And so I love that holistic view of what this couple's life is and will be. And then on the right-hand side, we have a photo of a couple, both very chicly dressed, both wearing hats tipped to the side. And the gentleman even has a cane. The woman is all done up with her coat and her gloves. And I'm not sure if she's holding a book in her hands, but I think they just look so cute with their matching outfits. I love it.
Yeah, that double negative effect that you mentioned, SD, you see that in that photograph where James has put in the figure of a child there at the feet of the newlyweds. Photo manipulation has been part of photography since the very beginning. A lot of people think, well, not until we had Photoshop did we start manipulating pictures. It was something that was done a long time ago, and it really helped extend the storytelling ability of the image. You could go beyond what the camera saw and add something in post-production. So it's very exciting to see that going beyond the couple and seeing into the future, and then being able to create a two-dimensional artwork. With the couple on the right, what I really like about this is the way, it's a very subtle, but the way his left foot is out as if he's taking a step, and it adds something very dynamic to this picture, which normally would be seen as very static. This looks like they're out for a stroll in Central Park, and it's a great picture.
And like before we talk about these set of photos, in the photo with the couple and the child, like I said, if you want to see how James Van der Zee's work has influenced artists in the contemporary day, Julie Dash's film, Daughters of the Dust, there's a scene where a photographer comes to take a portrait of the family, and he's got, like David talked about, the huge camera that produces like 8x10 negatives and all this equipment. And when he looks through the lens to look at the photo, standing next to one of the couples is a little girl. And he's surprised because when he steps away from the camera, she's not there. But when he looks through the lens, she is there. And so in that particular story, it talks about one of the couples of the family, how the wife is expecting a child. And I love Julie Dash's nod to James Van Der Zee of how James Van Der Zee said that the role of the photographer and the role of the camera is not only to see what's there, but also to see what isn't there. Okay, so in these two photos, you have two very, very chicly dressed folks. They look like they're sort of posing either in the living room or like in the bedroom, like next to their vanities, like the mirror and their makeup. And it sort of has that sort of like at home feeling, like you're getting a peek into their personal lives. And this is something that James Van Der Zee pulled from the Victorian and Edwardian traditions of how people would pose in their homes with different props to show their wealth or to show that they were educated and could read and write, depending. And over time, people wanted something that was a little more personal, to show off more about who they were, rather than some of the other details that were more important in the Victorian and Edwardian times. I love the hat of the woman on the left, and I love the big bell sleeves and fur of the person on the right, and the fur around the bottom of the dress. It's like so luxurious.
I was fascinated by the image on the left that it looks like a Chinese figurine that's sitting on that table. And
yeah, it looks like a Buddha.
Yeah, and although I'm supposed to be drawn to the subject, I can't help but wonder about that piece of art that's sitting on that table. I like the way that little tablecloth also kind of falls down and drapes down and mirrors the drape of her dress as it falls from her. Mm-hmm. The figure on the right, what I was struck is kind of the flowers that are in that scene, and trying to imagine that what if those flowers weren't there, and you'd be more focused on that subject. Because I think with the image on the left, if you took that little Buddha statue away, you kind of get that feeling that she's about to fall off the edge of that table, the way that she's sitting there. So it kind of creates that balance. Probably the most interesting thing about the photograph on the right and doing some research about it is that's the title of this image is The Bow of the Ball. So that is actually a male figure being photographed in women's attire. And we don't know really much beyond that image, but one thing I think we can say about it is that this individual trusts James Van Der Zee to take this picture of him, that create this story for him, that a lot of people, because of people not accepting cross-dressing at that time, would not be able to see this part of this person's life. And I think it's impressive that James Van Der Zee was able to work with and capture this image that I'm sure was very special to this individual.
Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about being a griot and preserving the history. That also looks like preserving the histories of everyday people and giving us a glimpse into their lives and what was important to them, and just little things like how they dress, how they would dress for a fancy occasion. Those details are important. And here we have two models posing. On the right, you have a portrait called Eve's Daughter of a woman that looks like she's standing by a river, sort of on the bank of a river, sort of in nature. And on the left, you have what looks like a dancer posing with a shawl in a very dramatic fashion. And this is definitely a departure from what David was talking about of in earlier times, because of the length it took to take a photograph, people needing to stand still for 5 or 10 minutes. And because of that, only being able to do poses where they could be leaned against a wall or leaned against a piece of furniture. And in this portrait on the left, obviously she's not leaning against anything. So I wonder if this was when photography and technology had advanced a little bit so that he could take this quick photo of her, posing with her arms outstretched, not being supported by anything.
For sure. I think that the technology advanced a little more to where you could get a little more dynamic in the posing and the expression. The lighting is also different in this image on the left. You can see how the lighting is capturing and playing off that the white veil that she is holding in her extended arm. On the image on the right, also exploring those this is a biblical theme, Eve's daughter. You can imagine this is kind of a Garden of Eden type tableau that James has created in his studio, and it's a really very nice piece.
Mm-hmm. Okay, next we have a portrait of three gentlemen. On the right, standing, holding the white hat, you have Marcus Garvey. On the left, you have George O'Mark. And in the middle, you have Prince Kojo Tuvalu Huno. And this portrait was taken in 1924. And when we first saw this portrait, David and I were speculating. I mean, obviously that's Marcus Garvey on the right, but we're like, which one of the other two gentlemen is the prince? And so I said, well, if I had to guess, I think the prince is the gentleman sitting in the middle. He's the only one sitting in this portrait. He's wearing all white. And traditionally in African cultures, white is either associated with death or associated with like high status, sort of wisdom and cleanliness and, being special. And so I was like, I feel like the prince is the one wearing all white. And also because it's really hard to keep white clothes clean. Like that's not something that we think about, but it is extremely difficult to keep an all white outfit clean. You have to be careful where you sit and, what you do with your hands and, sort of like brushing your hands on your clothes and like all these little gestures. So to maintain that immaculate nature of the white cloth takes a certain self-awareness and a change of habits. And so that's something that is very important to many African cultures, Yoruba, Haitian. And so that was my guess, was what I knew about it. And it turned out I was right. And there are other photographs that were taken of that same day, of the three of them standing in different positions. But the one that is sort of the most famous is this one with the prince sitting in his chair. And they just look like regular dining chairs, but something about his posture, he has his shoulders back and he has his legs crossed. He just gives off that regal vibe, like he's in charge.
Yeah, I really like the grouping of this as you kind of think about that formal portraiture. You could imagine someone saying, okay, everyone squeeze in. But in this image, they're standing apart and they're kind of giving him his space. And I think that does kind of lend to that bit of royalty where you could be close, but not that close. And I think that's captured here very well in this image and communicated. So many years later, we can look at it and we get that sense and we get that vibe and that little bit of the story that's being told. Just by the posing of these gentlemen. Well, thank you, SD. I think that's the images that we were going to cover, and I just have a couple of more slides to go through.
Okay.
So James Van Der Zee's career started to wane around the 1950s. That was a result of the coming of cameras that were being mass produced and getting in the hands of the American public. Now, this actually started way back at the turn of the century with the development of a camera called the Kodak Brownie. And it was kind of like the Model T of cameras. Millions were made and people suddenly were able to take their own pictures, not quite as beautiful as the ones James Van Der Zee was doing, but they had that power within them. So after World War II, things really exploded. We had a lot of wealth in our country. People were moving out to suburbs. And people were buying cameras and starting to document all parts of their lives, not the big moments such as getting married or the birth of a first child. They were starting to get to take pictures of things like their first car and their first house. They're starting to put those in photo albums and starting to put them on their walls. And this were the beginnings of being able to tell the stories of their family, of when they got married, and their first car, their first child, their first animal, their first pet. They were able to document that with cameras. So storytelling really became enhanced by these everyday tools. By the time the 60s rolled around, the Brownie was already kind of getting phased out, and the Instamatic was the camera of choice. Just the name Instamatic gives you goosebumps thinking, oh wow, in an instant I can have a picture. Not quite, but you could drop it at a photo mat, you could drive up to it, drop off a canister of film, and then within a day it would be ready for you to pick up, and you'd have your pictures of your pets, your children, your first house, the Great Blizzard of 1977, whatever. That's a picture of my own camera. I bought that in a garage sale in the early 70s from a neighbor for, I think, 25 cents. I wasn't very interested in the photography at the time. It was more having this really cool piece of technology. In the 70s, everyone started getting the Polaroid camera, which really did mean you can have an instant photo. You'd click that red button and you'd start hearing the machine whirring and making these noises. And then all of a sudden, ejected was this glossy, foggy image. And then you could see it develop right before your eyes, and you really didn't have to shake it. That's something that I'm not sure where that came from, but it would develop and you had an instant picture. And it actually had a little place at the bottom where you could write a memo to yourself of someone's first Christmas or Thanksgiving, 1979. In the late 1990s, digital cameras started being developed. They were kind of pricey and their resolution wasn't very good, but it was the start of the beginning of a revolution. And so by the 2000s, by the start of the millennium, digital photography really in cameras really took off. They started to get more affordable. People could buy a camera off the shelf and start taking beautiful pictures. But what started with happening was the traditional film camera was kind of going away, but luckily has not died a complete death. There's still some people that want to practice that analog art. They want to have that same experience that James Van Der Zee experienced when he would take film negatives and then produce fine art prints from them. Nowadays, everyone carries a camera around them every day in their smartphone. And they also have the capability of shooting video. You can imagine what James Van Der Zee would think about that. And with that, we're no longer really putting photos in our photo albums, but those photo albums are digital now. And we carry them on our phones, or we're now creating or broadcasting our lives through social media, such as Facebook and Instagram. And that's quite a change in the way that we've done images in the past. So as I close, I want to close on a couple of inspirational quotes. The first is, "You are the hero of your own success story." And I think of Dr. Martin Luther King, who was certainly a hero to many, and because of his convictions that he lived a great life and unfortunately an untimely death. But in light of our conversations today about storytelling, I think I'd like to modify this phrase and say, "You are the photo editor of your life's documentary. So be thoughtful about what you include and what you share." So this concludes the first part of our presentation, and I'm going to turn it over to SD to introduce our second half.
Awesome. So continuing on with our theme of the artist as storyteller, and the artist is Griot, and the importance of storytelling. The second artist that we're going to talk about is Emory Douglas. And with James Van Der Zee, we talked about a more traditional African perspective on what community service is and what community service can look like. With Emory Douglas, we're going to talk about him as a griot and a more Western contemporary understanding of community service. So Emory Douglas, as featured in these two photos, on the left, that's just a picture of him, and on the right is a picture of him standing next to an exhibit of his art. Emory Douglas is a printmaker and artist. He was born in 1943 on May 24th, and he was born in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He studied printmaking at San Francisco City College, and he joined the Black Panther Party in 1967. And so when we talk about service, Emory Douglas's art for him was very much a community service. When he joined the Black Panther Party, he was appointed to be the Minister of Culture. And what that meant was his job was to put out the Black Panther Party's newsletter to inform people of current events that were going on, and also to let them know where they could go to get free food from the food drives and what other community programs were available to them, and also to provide realistic and inspiring images of Black people. So those were his two main concerns. And Justine is going to help me present this part of the presentation. Hi, Justine. Let's go to the next slide. So these are two examples of Black Panther Party newsletters that were designed by Emory Douglas. And one of the things that he said was that when they were first starting out, they could not afford ink. So they had to go with black and one other color for their designs. So that's why the majority of his early designs are monochromatic. Justine, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, so Emory Douglas used something called was it a two-tone offset print, and that was a lot of the reason they used that is because of the cost. It was a little bit cheaper, and so we can kind of see that here in this red image. Yeah, we see the monochromatic color scheme.
So on the left, on the cover of the Black Panther Party newsletter, you have Fred Hampton, who was the chairman of the Chicago chapter of the Black Panther Party. And on the right, you have a image of a soldier crying, and in his helmet, you have a scene of what looks like people. I'm not sure if it's soldiers. The image is a little small on my screen, but the soldier is holding a sign, a picket sign that says, "Our fight is not in Vietnam." And on the left, it says, "Free the GIs." So Emory Douglas's goal with the Black Panther newsletter was to let people know what the Black Panther Party was about and to let them know how they could participate in making positive changes in their community and how they could be of service. So one of the things that he had to deal with was that a lot of Black people at the time in the late 60s and early 70s were not educated, did not have a college education, couldn't read very well, had a very low literacy rate. So he wanted his images to be clear where anybody could look at them and understand the point that he was making just by looking at the image and reading the caption. And so part of what the newsletter was for, again, was to let people know about current events that were going on, but it was also to explain the philosophy and the goals of the Black Panther Party. So they had what they call the 10-point program, and they wanted land, food, housing, education, freedom, and peace. And so in the 10 points, they explained that they wanted free healthcare for all. They wanted everybody to have food, everybody to have a quality education. They wanted an end to all of the wars because they understood how it affected people in the community. Lots of people had loved ones in the military who were putting their lives at risk. And they also understood in the larger scale of things how wars affect women and children and how they disrupt families and cause people to have food insecurity. So for those reasons, they were against all wars, not just the Vietnam War specifically. And so these were the kind of things that they wanted to communicate to everyday people. We'll go to the next slide. So here you have a graphic image that says freedom, and that word is in a book. And then on the right, you have another Panther newsletter that has Angela Davis in the center, as well as some other figures depicted around her, Harriet Tubman and Huey Newton on the bottom. And I think that might be Kathleen Cleaver on the left. And the headline of the newsletter is Angela Davis, a Black woman in the liberation struggle. So now we can look back on this and see a historical document that at the time, this was the current news. These were the current headlines. And Angela Davis wasn't a member of the Black Panther Party, but she was a Black woman and one of their contemporaries who was doing work to make life better for Black people specifically and everyone in general. And so the newsletter wanted to let people know, here's an example of a Black woman that's doing something to make the world a better place. And you should know about her if you haven't heard of her before. And these are examples of things that you can do. And the phrase that they used was to get people to observe and participate. Observe what's going on in your neighborhood and then participate in what's going on in a way that is beneficial. So one of the things that the Black Panthers started were what they called their community programs. They would get up early in the morning and they would cook breakfast for the school children and give them free breakfast, because they understood the impact that hunger had on children's ability to learn and perform well in school. They also gave out groceries to people that needed food. And they also had after school programs where they tutored children and helped them with their homework. And they also opened free health clinics where doctors and nurses and medical professionals volunteered. And they were the first to test for sickle cell anemia and to provide that service in the community. And those things eventually became staples that schools provide free breakfasts for children all across the country. And there are several medical clinics and hospitals where you can go and get tested for sickle cell anemia. But the Black Panther Party was the first to do those two things. And that's how they became part of the dominant culture. And they really wanted to focus on taking care of each other and taking care of their community. So we can go to the next slide and see other examples of Emory Douglas's work. So, go ahead, Justine.
Okay, yeah, so this is an example of something that Emory Douglas has done later in life. So we see here the original poster that he made in the 60s, and then last year he took this poster and he revamped it for the cover of a Spike Lee movie called To Five Bloods, and it follows the story of five Black soldiers in Vietnam. And so he's done this with a few other pieces as well. But when he was younger, when he was sort of getting his start into printmaking, he started when he was at the youth training school and he worked in their print shop. And then a little while later, he started taking commercial art classes from the City College in San Francisco. And he also had a downstairs neighbor, Charles Bible, who was another artist that every year on Malcolm X's birthday, he would make a run of prints. And so he sort of learned the basics from Charles Bible. And so this is an example of how he has sort of revisited his work and turned it into something new and has updated it a little bit. And yeah, so here are some images of children being depicted in his work for these, for the magazine covers, especially because children were really impacted by what the Black Panthers were doing. They had the free breakfast program, which is still in schools today and has become pretty important to the lives of children even now. Some other programs include a liberation school. SD mentioned the health clinics that were testing for sickle cell anemia. They also had a program called Seniors Against Fearful Environment, which I thought was really interesting. So seniors in certain communities were asking for protection when they went to cash their checks because they are a vulnerable population. And so the Black Panther Party offered some training classes in self-defense and things like that for seniors. They also had I think it was called the People's Ambulance Service. It was like a free ambulance service for people in communities. And then they also had a free food program, which I believe SD mentioned, for people getting groceries and being able to feed their families as well.
Yeah, so this next image is great, and this is actually a newer image that Emery Douglas composed. I think it's copyright 2020. Is that correct, Justine? Yeah, so when I saw this image, I was like, ooh, I could immediately see the differences between this and some of the work that he did in the 60s and 70s. First of all, his use of line work and line weight is different, and he's got a little bit more shading and shadow and texture to his work. The other thing is that his work isn't monochromatic anymore, right? In this one, you have two different shades of blue, well, three different shades of blue. You have the blue of the boy's collar, the blue of his shirt, and then the turquoise of the background wall, as well as the purple and the different oranges and yellows of the food that they're eating and the juice that they're drinking. And they have little buttons on their shirts. The boys' button says, "I'm food insecure," and the girls' button says, "I'm homeless." And so this is Emery Douglas revisiting a topic that he has been portraying in his artwork for decades, which is that even to this day, unfortunately, there are still Black children who rely on some form of community service to provide them with food and breakfast before they go to school. And so in this one, he's depicting them having a healthy breakfast. The boy is eating fruit, it looks like peaches and bananas, and the girl is eating pancakes and strawberries, and they both have a little styrofoam cup of orange juice. And if you check out the documentary, The Black Panthers, Vanguard of the Revolution, they have crucial interviews with surviving members of the Black Panther Party. And most of the members of the Black Panther Party were women. And they are the ones who ran the day-to-day aspects of the Black Panther Party, dealing with new recruits, getting them orientated, cooking the food, picking the food, first of all, going and getting the groceries to make the breakfast, making the breakfast for the children, making sure everybody got something to eat, cleaning up, making sure they had those relationships maintained with the distributors where they got food from and the vendors, and making sure they had in-kind donations. And a lot of the women sort of did what has been called the invisible labor of maintaining the day-to-day of the Black Panther Party, also, you know, dealing with their records and things like that. And for them, that was the heart of the work of the party, was running the community programs, helping with the free breakfast program, with the liberation school, helping tutor Black children, making sure they were doing well with their schoolwork, working in the health clinic, helping out elders with things that they needed, like making sure that they didn't get mugged while they were trying to cash their Social Security check and things like that. To those Black women in the Panther Party, that was what the Black Panther Party was about. And many were disappointed with the leadership of the Black Panther Party, Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, and Eldridge Cleaver, and their ego about being in charge, and, you know, the publicity stunts that they would do, like marching to Capitol buildings with guns and all of those things. A lot of the regular members of the Black Panther Party felt were a distraction from the work that the Black Panther Party was doing in improving the community, and how it really was a youth organization. Emery Douglas has said that the majority of the members were between 16 and 19, and that Eldridge Cleaver and Bobby Seale were like 28, and they were considered the old men of the party. It really was, right? David's laughing. Yeah, because the majority of the members were between 16 and like 21, and not even 21, like 16 and 19. So to be 28 was considered like, wow, you're so old. And I think that's hilarious because I'm 28. It's not that old, but anyway. So they talked about how this kept them off the street, it kept them out of gangs, it kept them off drugs. And a lot of members felt that the newer waves of people that joined the Black Panther Party had the wrong idea of what the party was about. You know, they would show up and they were like, "I want a leather jacket and a gun." And they're just like, this, it's not a gang. Like, that's not what it's about. Like, you realize that you're going to be getting up at 4 a.m. to make pancakes for elementary school children. And so one of the things that Fred Hampton had before he was assassinated was that he was really, really good at motivating the new recruits to have that commitment to working out, taking care of themselves, showing up to all the community programs, recruiting new people. And there are videos of him training the new recruits, and they're outside like 4 a.m. doing jumping jacks, and he's, you know, giving them all these mantras, and he's like, what are we doing this for? And they're like, for the people. And, you know, who do we live for? We live for the people. And so he was really able to inspire these really young teenagers to change their life around. A lot of them came into the party and they were struggling with drug addiction. And through their participation in the party, they were able to get clean and turn their life around and finish school and do something that was actually a benefit to themselves and their loved ones and their neighbors. And a lot of that was overshadowed by the publicity stunts and the fallout between Huey Newton and Aldrich Cleaver, and them wanting to split the party up and have everybody choose sides. And a lot of the regular members, like I said, were just so disappointed by that and felt like Aldrich Cleaver and Huey Newton, by fighting with each other, were distracting from the work that needed to be done and the problems that they wanted to focus on solving in their communities. So here we have more examples of the art of Emory Douglas. He really wanted to put out uplifting images of Black people to show them what life could be like and what they could do, and sort of give them the role models that hadn't previously been given by the media. So a lot of his work focuses on women and showing them as, you know, capable, getting groceries, having weapons, defending themselves. And part of the inspiration of why they chose the panther as the party's animal is because the panther, when you talk about on the Western Hemisphere, a panther refers to a Black jaguar. And jaguars or panthers are solitary creatures. They travel alone. They're not like lions. They don't live in big groups. They like to keep to themselves. They don't like to bother anybody. But if you corner them, they will attack you. They will fight back and defend themselves. But, you know, if you just see one crossing your path, they'll be like, whatever. And they'll just go on about their business. But if you corner them, they'll fight back. And so they originally, it was called the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, but it was just too long of a name, so they shortened it to the Black Panther Party. But that was why they picked the panther as their mascot, so to speak. It's like, we're not, you know, we're not violent by nature. We're not going out there to just attack people. But if you attack us, we will defend ourselves. So here you have 2 images, one of a Black woman laughing on the right. She's got a little Black Panther button on her shirt. And on the left, you have a young boy selling the Black Panther newspaper, which says "All power to the people" on the front, which was one of their slogans.
And this image of the woman in the blue skirt would not have been a cover of the Black Panther Party magazine. This would have been a poster, which was also used in communities while they were distributing the magazines. They would also use wheat paste to put these images up in communities. And like SD said, this was often to communicate to people that were in areas with lower literacy. And so Emory Douglas knew that strong imagery was really important, and using these potent images was so important to communicating to people, even if it's not with words, it's still with a general attitude, it's still with the mood of the images that really, I don't know, brought people together. And on to the next slide. So here's another image of, or another representation of women doing invisible labor and things that would have been a little bit behind the scenes. We also saw images earlier of women carrying guns. And so there was a really diverse representation of what these women were doing. And I think that was especially important because women did make up about 2/3 of the Black Panther Party, and they were the ones that were doing a lot of work that may not have gotten as much publicity. We see here also another image with a child in it, and the caption says, "Freedom is a constant struggle." And so something that I've noticed in these images is that there's this call to bond with other members of the community and that goes across generations, it goes across all ages. There was a really strong sense of togetherness.
Like I said before, their slogan was to, we can go on to the next slide. Their slogan was to observe and participate. And so they wanted people to pay attention to what was going on around them and to notice some of the things that they maybe had taken for granted, and then to participate in what was going on and in being the change that they wanted to see in the world. And like Justine said, 2/3 of the Black Panther Party were women, and that wasn't a new trend. The majority of the civil rights movement was also Black women. Even the Montgomery bus boycotts that were famously spearheaded by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was put together by the Women's Council, and they are the ones that did, the invisible labor of making the flyers and passing them out to everybody in the community and letting people know that they were going to make this decision to have an economic boycott of the buses, since they weren't allowed to have full and equal use of the buses. And so there never would have been a boycott without these women. And so as an African scholar, when we learned about these movements, they wouldn't have happened without the participation of regular everyday people who were willing to step up and be like, you know what, I'm going to do something about changing my reality and making it more like what I would like it to be. And so that was something that the Black Panthers had witnessed, from their parents and aunts and uncles and grandparents who participated in the civil rights movement in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And after the assassination of Dr. King, they were like, you know what, we're going to try a different approach to get the results that we're looking for. And so here you have two very lovely, thoughtful images of Black men with weapons and with Black Panther Party buttons. And the image on the left, on the top, it says "Revolution in Our Lifetime." So one of the things that Emory Douglas tried to do was to show unity among Black people and to show them taking care of each other, and to show Black women as capable of defending themselves, and also showing Black men as the protectors of their community. And being like, instead of participating in these gangs that destroy our community, you should step up to protect the community, protect your neighbors, protect the children, make sure everybody is safe.
These images were also, this was part of the updated motifs that was done. These were done in 2009. So Emory Douglas revisited his work, pulled out some of the strong images, and then sort of rebranded them. I think he did a limited run of prints. This was for the Alani Gallery in Australia, and he did an exhibit with Richard Bell. And
there's an connection between the Aborigines in Australia and the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party did send members out to various countries throughout the world to build a coalition of oppressed peoples, as they called it. And they sent people to Australia to talk to the Aborigines there and to learn about the situation that the Aborigines were going through, and to learn how they were similar and how they could help each other and how they could be of service to each other. So because of the influence of the Black Panther Party, the Australian Aborigines started their own chapter of the Black Panther Party, and to this day they identify as Black. So a lot of times people think that Black is synonymous with African, and that's not actually the case. It really was more so a term of political solidarity between these different ethnic groups of people throughout the world that had similar experiences with imperialism. Here is a very, very lovely sort of dual portrait of Fred Hampton, chairman of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party. And on one of the rays at the top, sort of coming out of his head, it has one of the famous quotes by him. And you can look up the documentary footage. He's giving a speech to the crowd. And one of the things he says is that you can jail a revolutionary or kill a revolutionary, but you can't kill the revolution.
So this image would have come out around the time that there was a party split in the Black Panther Party. There was some, well, COINTELPRO was a large part of the dissolution of the Black Panther Party. And there was some different ideas about how that should be confronted. So people were asking questions about, well, is armed resistance the method that we want to go with, or should we choose a more nonviolent route? And so that was like the bigger component of the split that sort of drove a wedge in between some of the leaders of the party. And there was also interest in expanding and sort of exploring options overseas, especially during the Korean War. And some people said, well, I don't really know that we need to be focusing on our efforts abroad when we have people here in the United States that need our help and that need the effort and the services that we're providing.
There were numerous things that caused split in the party. And like Justine said, COINTELPRO was one of them. COINTELPRO was stands for Counterintelligence Program, which was run by the FBI under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, where they investigated any groups and any individuals that they considered to be a threat to the United States government. So although the Black Panther Party was mostly teenagers between 16 and 19, and they had no idea that they were considered a threat to the United States government, because in their mind, they're just trying to get everybody in their community off drugs and feed the children and give out groceries. So they were not aware that they were on the FBI's radar. And so what the FBI did was they hired several people, including police officers in different parts of the country, to pretend to be interested in joining the Black Panther Party. And then they would go into the Black Panther Party and they would, read all the information, read all the newsletters that they were sending out, take their stationery and send threatening letters to people in the community. They would cause fights, they would start problems. They would go to the local grocery stores that provided food for the breakfast programs and threaten them so that they wouldn't want to donate food anymore. And then they would go around and tell the people in the neighborhood things like, oh, the food that the Black Panther Party gives out is poisoned. And so they really caused the collapse of the Black Panther Party from the inside. And like Justine said, when it was found out that the party had been infiltrated by people that were being paid by the government to cause chaos, they really had no idea how to address it. And so the party kind of just collapsed from within.
Yeah, so that's a little bit about Emory Douglas and how he had to be a storyteller of a whole movement. And so we've sort of followed that journey through the images that he made. And I think that's about all we've got for you today. But this afternoon, we will be having a few classes. And so we've got one on storytelling and imagery, storytelling alone, and then imagery alone. And there is a link to sign up for them if you want to join us for those this afternoon. They will be starting at 1 p.m. Central Time.
So thank you everyone for joining us today. This is our Martin Luther King Jr. Day National Service Project, the artist as Griot, the importance of storytelling. Today we told you the story of two famous artists, James Vanderzee, one of the first Black photographers, and Emory Douglas, a contemporary artist who luckily is still alive and still with us, and the importance of preserving information and passing it on to people so that we can remember where we've been and figure out where we're going. As Marcus Garvey said, people without a history is like a tree without roots. Thank you so much for joining us on the behalf of Imagine Art and AmeriCorps. I'm Esti Kendra. We have my co-hosts Justine and David. I hope you enjoyed our presentation and will join us at 1 for our Zoom classes. Thank you so much and have a great day. Bye, everyone.